Welcome to the Addendum, a thing added. On this podcast, Pastor Eric Williams will add to, clarify, and supplement the most recent teachings at Fellowship Renewed Church.
This story in Luke chapter 5 brings up questions of sin and the forgiveness of sin. And so today I thought we could take a little bit of time and talk about how sins are forgiven. Now, we did touch on that yesterday in our time together, but today I would like to do a few things that I didn't quite have time for. I wanted to get to, I had prepared, but we have time to discuss that here in our time together today. So let's just look at chapter 5, verses 18 through 21. I'll read it. It says, "And behold, some men were bringing on a bed a man who was paralyzed, and they were seeking to bring him in and lay him before Jesus. But finding no way to bring him in because of the crowd, they went up on the roof and let him down with his bed through the tiles in the midst before Jesus. And when he saw their faith, he said, 'Man, your sins are forgiven you.' And the scribes and the Pharisees began to question, saying, 'Who is this who speaks blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God alone?'" Now, we did take time on that note, didn't we? We talked about how if sins are committed, these are transgressions, sins, iniquities, wrongdoing. If those are against God, if our offenses are against God, then God is the one who must be the one forgiving those sins, because who can forgive a transgression against the Lord, a sin against God, but God himself? And so this brings together that connection between Jesus and his divine identity. Now, this isn't making him divine, just as Jesus' baptism did not make him divine, but Jesus is divine. And these stories and these scenarios just reveal and uncover that truth about his true identity. And so this is certainly a very helpful and explicit passage about the nature of Jesus. It is explicit in the sense that these are questioning Jesus, saying, "Who can forgive sins but God alone?" And they're correct. And so what's being said is, Jesus is the one forgiving sins, and only God can forgive sins. And so this is saying something about the nature of Jesus. Now, as he goes throughout his earthly ministry, I noted that there's a sense of escalation in Jesus' ministry. It's not everything all at once when Jesus begins, is it? But instead, it takes a path, and it's a path of progression, and it escalates. And of course, it culminates at one point as well, doesn't it? Okay, so let's look at verses 22 through 24. What does that say? "When Jesus perceived their thoughts, he answered them, 'Why do you question in your hearts? Which is easier to say, "Your sins are forgiven you," or to say, "Rise and walk"? But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, he said to the man who was paralyzed, 'I say to you, rise, pick up your bed, and go home.'" So that little phrase right there, that little situation, "Your sins are forgiven you, rise and walk," Jesus precedes that by asking a question. Why do you question this in your heart? Because they had just said that Jesus was speaking blasphemies. He said, "Why do you question this? Which is easier to say, 'Your sins are forgiven you,' or to say, 'Rise and walk'?" That's Jesus' question to them. Now, the man clearly has a problem. He's paralyzed. But Jesus sees past his physical situation and says, this man has a much greater issue, that in my presence and according to faith, I can actually heal. I can actually bring healing to this man's situation. The ultimate healing that this man needs, the forgiveness of sin. And Jesus says, "Your sins are forgiven you." But Jesus says, but which is easier to say? Rise and walk, or to say your sins are forgiven you? He says, "But so that you may know, in order that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, he said to the man, rise, pick up your bed and go home. And so Jesus had already done the greater thing here. Jesus had already forgiven the man of his sins. But to authenticate, to show who exactly he is, Jesus then performs this miracle on the man, saying, what I just told the guy, what I just told this paralyzed man that his sins are forgiven, I'm showing you with actual evidence that what I just said is true. I'm authenticating my message with the miracle. Okay, and so that's the situation of what happens. But of course, this does beg a question here of how the man's sins were forgiven. Were the man's sins forgiven on the basis of his friend's faith, or were the man's sins forgiven on the basis of his own faith? I thought we could look a little bit into that and some other stories in Luke. There's one other situation in Luke, one other place in Luke, only one other place, where Jesus explicitly says, your sins are forgiven. And that's in Luke chapter 7, and I'll read at first verses 37 through 39. That's just a couple of verses. But then I'll also read verses 46 and 47. So I'll skip just a little bit in the narrative to get to the end. So this is Luke 7, beginning in verse 37. And behold, a woman of the city who was a sinner, when she learned that he was reclining at the table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of ointment, and standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears and wipe them with her hair on her head, and kissed his feet and anointed them with the ointment. Now, when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. All right, that's step number one. And we're going to skip just a little bit in the narrative, but so that's the situation. He's in the house of a Pharisee, and this woman who was a sinner. I think we can understand what kind of sinner she was. She was a woman of the city who was a sinner. And so the Pharisee thinks in his own heart and says to himself, if this man were truly a prophet, then he would know, by means of him being a prophet, what kind of woman was touching him, and he would never want a sinner, this kind of woman, this dirty woman, touching him, that is morally dirty. He wouldn't want her in his presence. And so the story continues. I'm going to pick up in verse 46. Jesus speaks directly back to the Pharisee. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But he who is forgiven little loves little. And he said to her, your sins are forgiven. Then those who were with him at the table began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? And he said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Okay, so there are some parallels, aren't there, to the story that we read in Luke 5 and this story here in Luke 7. And you see a woman who actually didn't need physical healing. She was morally impure. She needed a different kind of cleansing and healing. And so in this situation, there's no physical element to it, but only Jesus forgives a woman who seemingly is unforgivable. He forgives a woman whose sins are many. If there was ever anybody in need of a forgiveness of sin, seemingly, that is to the eye, our observation would tell us that if anybody needs forgiveness of sin, it's going to be this woman because she's very sinful. And so Jesus says, your faith has saved you, go in peace, and your sins are forgiven. That's what he says in verse 48. Okay, so there's a connection I just want you to see between Jesus saying your sins are forgiven and your faith has saved you. Your sins are forgiven, take that on one side. Your faith has saved you, take it on the other side. Are those connected, you think, in any way? Your sins are forgiven, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. And just like Jesus says to the paralyzed man, to go. Rise up and go home. You can walk now. And so he does. All right, so the word here for your faith has saved you. Your faith has saved you. It is the word sozo in Greek, and that's a common word, very common word. But it just means it does mean to save. It means to deliver. It can also mean to make well. Obviously delivered from whatever ails you, right? So you have a deliverance from a sickness, you are made well. So it can be translated differently in different circumstances, but here it says, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Another thing just to note about that word, though, is that it's in the perfect tense. The perfect tense. Perfect active tense. Actually, perfect tense and active. And so what does that mean? Well, something that's in the perfect tense would say that there's something that happened in the past and you're experiencing the effects of it in the here and now. All right? And the emphasis here with it being in active is that it's emphasizing the faith of the woman has saved her. That is, her faith has saved her in the past, that is, at the moment of faith, and she stands in that reality today, in the here and now, right? Hopefully that makes sense. Well, the reason I bring that up is because of what will be said here in just a moment. All right, let's look also at Luke chapter 8. So again, in Luke 7, that's the only other explicit reference to your sins are forgiven, right? Where Jesus actually says that your sins are forgiven. Luke 7 and Luke 5 are the only places where we find that. But we do find faith over and over. And there are a couple of places, really just a couple of more, where we find that faith is found in direct correlation to a person being made well or saved. Because remember that it's actually the exact same word, and just context helps us determine what's being meant by that. All right, so next story I want to look at is in Luke 8, verses 46 through 48. And it says, "But Jesus said, 'Someone touched me, for I perceive that power has gone out from me.'" You're remembering this situation probably. "When the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling, falling down before him, and declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him, and how she had been immediately healed. And he said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace.'" Okay, so that's the exact same word in the exact same tense. Your faith has made you well. Now, in the connection in Luke 7, your sins are forgiven, your faith has made you well. Do you see that? Let me look back at it. He said to you, your sins are forgiven, your faith has saved you. Now, it doesn't say made well there, because in the situation in Luke 7, what is she made well from? You see, in this other situation, Luke 8, the reason it's translated differently is because she had some kind of physical issue. Now, if she had had no physical issue, guess how this would have been translated? Your faith has saved you. Your faith has saved you. But because she was healed of something physically, this declaration, your faith has made you well, again, I'm telling you, it's the exact same word, letter for letter. It's the same word. In Luke 7, it's translated, your faith has saved you. In Luke 8, it's translated, your faith has made you well, at least by the ESV. And so the only difference is that in Luke 8, there was something to be healed of, whereas in Luke 7, there was no physical thing to be healed of, so obviously the faith didn't make her well because she was not ill. So her faith must have done something different. What did her faith do for her? Well, her faith saved her. Saved her how? Saved her in what way? It's because her sins were forgiven. Faith caused her to be saved. Do you see that connection? All right, Luke 17. What is this one? This one is let me just read it before I make comments on it. Beginning in verse 11, "On the way to Jerusalem, he was passing along in between Samaria and Galilee, and he entered a village, and he was met by 10 lepers who stood at a distance and lifted up their voices, saying, 'Jesus, Master, have mercy on us.' And when he saw them, he said to them, 'Go show yourselves to the priest.' And as they went, they were cleansed." Cleansed is the word. "Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed," which is the same as cleansed here, right, in context, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. He fell on his faith, on his faith. Well, maybe he did. That's actually probably correct, but that's not what it says. I just misspoke. He fell on his face at Jesus' feet, giving him thanks. Now, he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus answered, "Were not 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" And he said to him, "Rise, go on your way. Your faith has made you well." Your faith has saved you. Your faith has made you well. Exact same wording as the others. What has this guy's faith done that it was not true for the other 9? Did all 10 have faith and it made them well? Was it the faith of the 10 that made them well? Or was there something distinct here about this 10th leper, that his faith saved him? See, he had faith in a way that the others obviously did not. I hope you see that. There was something special about this one. Luke 18:41 through 43, last situation here. It says, "What do you want me to do for you?" And he said, "Lord, let me recover my sight." And Jesus said to him, "Recover your sight. Your faith has made you well." And immediately he recovered his sight. He followed him, glorifying God, and all the people, when they saw it, they gave praise to God. So just another situation of a blind man recovering his sight. But Jesus' response is, "Your faith has made you well." Again, letter for letter, same word, using that root there, sozo, of just saying that he has been saved or he has been delivered from something. Is there anything greater to that? Well, here's the thing I want to say, is that you see in Jesus' ministry here, as he's healing, number one, that his miracles are authenticating his message. They're authenticating his nature. He's saying who he is. He's saying what he came to do. He's saying that he forgives sins. And this is authenticated by the works that he's producing, signs and wonders, right? And so this is proving Jesus' story. If this wasn't true of him, he wouldn't be able to do these things. Just as one person says, no one can do these things unless the hand of God is with him. No one can do this unless God is with him. And that's right. And so he's doing these things, and he's able to actually prove that what he's saying is true. Now, that's one thing. Another thing that's happening here is that what's being displayed before our eyes that we can go back and see is that there is a connection, a strong connection, a very serious connection that Jesus continues to draw out. And what is that? A connection between faith and deliverance. Faith and deliverance, faith in being saved, faith in being made well. And so what we must have, what Jesus is saying, you must have, what's most important that you have is faith. Faith in anything, faith in anyone, no, faith in Jesus, and faith in who he is and what he said. You need to have faith in the person and work. That's why I phrase it that way so often, the person and work of Jesus Christ. Who he is, what he did, and of course all he said about himself and all that the scriptures say about him. All right, so another place here, if we're remembering that Luke wrote Acts as well, how does this idea progress? How does Luke develop his own themes of salvation and theology? And it's okay to speak that way, by the way, when we're trying to think, because writers write in such a way as to actually develop things for us. And so it's not that the thing is not there, it's that they want to show you in their own way. I mean, Luke even tells us that he wanted to write a certain way to create an orderly account, didn't he? And so what he's saying is, I wrote this a certain way for you because I want you to experience it a certain way. I want you to understand it a certain way. And so then when we get to the book of Acts, we understand that Luke wrote Acts. And so when we get to these situations here that come later, we know that Luke is not changing his mind about how salvation works, right? So we'll fast forward all the way to Acts chapter 26, and we're going to talk about Paul's conversion, and when things change from Peter over to Paul, and now we're kind of focusing on Paul's apostolic ministry and all that he's doing, and he's talking of his conversion story and what Paul is to go preach. Don't you think that what what Jesus himself told Paul to preach is the true gospel message. Oh, that sets off a little bell for thinking about Galatians, doesn't it? But don't you think that in Paul's conversion, when Paul was instructed by Jesus to go and preach a certain thing, that thing that he was to preach is the thing that people need to hear? Are we all in agreement about that? It says in Acts 26, beginning in verse 15, "And I said, 'Who are you, Lord?' And the Lord said, 'I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and stand upon your feet, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to appoint you as a servant and witness to the things in which you have seen me, and to those in which I will appear to you, delivering you from your people and from the Gentiles, to whom I am sending you, to open their eyes, so that they may turn from darkness to light, from the power of Satan to God, here's what I want to emphasize. Look at this. That they turn from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me." So here we have Jesus appearing to Paul sometime later, and Luke has in mind, as he's writing, of course, everything he had written previously. He's not contradicting himself. He's further developing himself. So the very message preached by Paul is connected to that message that Jesus was proclaiming during his earthly ministry. Faith and the forgiveness of sins. Faith and the forgiveness of sins. It's the same. It's the same message. All right, so Romans 10, 9 through 13. Now, this is actually Paul writing. "Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved." Saved. You will be made well. "For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved." There it is again. There's that word, saved. "For the scriptures say, everyone who believes in him, will not be put to shame. For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is Lord of all, bestowing riches on all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." Delivered. Delivered from what? What is it that we most need to be delivered from? From sin. From the wrath of sin. We need to be delivered from the wrath of sin. And when we are saved. And how do we become saved? By faith in Jesus Christ. And when we have faith in Jesus Christ, what do we receive on our behalf? We receive the forgiveness of sins. And when we receive the forgiveness of sins, we are saved. We are saved from the wrath for sin. When sin is forgiven, there remains no more wrath for sin. And so we are saved. We are delivered. We have everything that we have ever needed and more in the grace of God. And that is why Paul also says, Ephesians 2:8, "For by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God." Now remember before I told you that the word used in the Gospels is in the perfect active. That is, it emphasizes the instrument of someone's faith saving them. But who is it who actually does the saving? Well, it depends on your emphasis in the moment when you're discussing it. Because here, and Paul speaks this way. He says, "For by grace you have been saved." Same word, just a different variation of that word, and he uses it in the perfect passive. Meaning, he's emphasizing that when you have faith in Jesus Christ, yes, you are saved. But it is actually God who does the saving, and this is how it's in the passive. That is, you are being acted on from something outside yourself. God saves you by means of faith in Jesus Christ. Your faith has saved you. Your faith has made you well. But let's not forget this reality, that the saving we need, the doing of saving, comes from the hand of God himself.
Thank you for joining us on the Addendum podcast. For more information about Fellowship Renewed Church, visit frcsparta.com. Please join us for next week's episode.